This being the third year of the Bosscinerator channel, the one thing I've learned from that time is that no matter how good or bad a game sounds from the people who talk about it, you never really know until you dive in and give it a go. And in the spirit of that, let's jump right into Assassin's Creed 4. Let's tackle the worst part of the game right out of the gate. Obviously, because Ubisoft employs a similar deafness to reality that Nintendo does, even though Desmond Miles died at the end of Assassin's Creed 3, we are not relieved of the franchise's much maligned framing device plot that has moved on to one of the most bizarre directions that no one saw coming. Instead of Desmond, the framing device is now captained by faceless character and has gone all first person on us, and while that's odd, the real weirdness comes quickly after as, since we're stuck with this guy for probably the next 3 or 4 games of this franchise, let's just call the guy Face for ironic points. As Face is traveling to his first day working for Abstergo Entertainment, a French video game developer that uses many Animus devices and these group of employees Face now works with to sift through DNA memories of Desmond Miles having been extracted from the Golden Temple and pick and choose the best assassins to make video games around in Abstergo's Animus game consoles. If you haven't figured it out yet, in Ubisoft's newest iteration of the franchise, they decided to have the main character work for a company that is basically Ubisoft, right down to the first day brochure listing a typical contract for a video game developer employee. And if you're still on my page, viewer, I'm sure you're as lost as I am as to why Ubisoft decided to recreate itself via proxy in Black Flag. But of course, this isn't the real reason we're here. This framing device bullshit is as useful as the B-plot in a Family Guy episode. No, we're here for some more historical shenanigans. Front and center this time, we get to enjoy the story of Sawyer from Lost going on an epic adventure to steal everything that isn't nailed down. And while that does sound incredibly snarky, the more I kept playing this game, the more I kept seeing Edward Kenway being a point-for-point homage to one of Abrams' great characters. Edward only gives a crap about himself, wants to live a life that he feels entitled to, despite the mounting facts that he keeps alienating everyone around him and being an irredeemable dickhead on his path to discovering greatness, only to somehow flummox his way into becoming good right at the end. The biggest difference between Edward and Sawyer is that Edward actually begins the game in a committed relationship with a real looker back in Wales. I think it was, but decides to give it up for visions of fortune on the high seas of a piratey ship that he manages to smuggle his way onto with his quick wordplay. Then, because Edward finds out that he has no idea what he's doing, manages to get on the ship that sailed right into a freak hurricane that destroyed the entire vessel and landed only him as the last survivor on an unmarked island with one hell of a jerkwad who was causing mayhem on a drowning ship. After 10 minutes of running around throwing fists and swearing a lot, Edward manages to kill the jerkwad and absconds with his robes and all his belongings. You heard it right here, folks. Edward Kenway, face of Black Flag, colloquially the best Assassin's Creed game in the franchise, managed to accident himself into becoming an assassin, and while that is hilarious, shortly after, Edward invents a way off of Marooned Island, he finds himself also accidentally becoming a Templar. You know, I get it. Visions of gold above all else, including common sense. Sterling Archer would definitely be proud of Edward's dick-first attitude into all his mishaps. Through this, Edward learns of the Templar plot of searching for a grand artifact of astronomical value that both sides of the conflict are hunting for. The only hitch is that the key to finding it is in the eyes of a local bumbler who turns out to be a prophecy sage. Thinking about it now, the Sage could probably best Edward in number of times he's saved by dumb luck in this game, considering he slips past the Templars and the Assassins faster than a greased-up ghost. Edward is soon ready to leave the coastal haven of Havana and set sail once again. And by that I mean he got pissed off with the paltry sum he was paid by the Templars for doing that job, and failed in trying to free the Sage in revenge for that, and ended up on a prison boat. One that was so bad at its job that Adewale and the prisoners, freed by Edward, wrested its control from the Spanish and retooled it into his personal piracy vessel, the Jackdaw. Funnily enough, the reason people laud this game as the only good Creed game in the franchise, or at least the best one, is how far it distances itself from the traditional thing that Creed is known for. The main vector for this shift is the Jackdaw and the game's many sailing mechanics. Sailing the vessel is a bit more complicated than I would have thought coming into the game and does take some getting used to, especially when the game starts adding in ship combat. Cannons must be pointed in the right direction, some strategizing needs to be employed in firefights due to the fact that broadside is the easiest point that each opponent can try to sink each other. And then you add in the fact you have to stay aware of your surroundings to avoid taking unnecessary damage from pelting face first into a giant boulder, and the additional weapons such as the mortar cannon and chase cannons, and you have quite the stew pot full of intriguing and convoluted combat schemes. What doesn't help is that if you don't actively grind on side quests and trading, you'll almost be constantly underleveled while playing this game. It doesn't make the game impossible, but there is a definite difficulty difference between having 16 and 32 cannons on the Jackdaw. Just doing the main campaign missions doesn't even come close to giving you the cash needed to upgrade the Jackdaw into something capable of taking on most of the game's end-level challenges, and Black Flag will not be holding your hand on some of the tougher challenges in the game. Quite a difference between Black Flag and every other game broken in half by spamming counterattacks all the time. It's blatantly obvious in Black Flag because they put the exciting new boating across the seas, destroying, looting, and pirating all the do-long day, alongside the regular Creed stuff that makes me want to cut off Edward's legs every time he jumps on land, because for some ridiculous reason, not only are the missions on land typical Creed fare, it's also the absolute worst stuff that Creed has to hand. All the missions on the islands in the campaign are tailing and eavesdropping missions, where you have to slowly follow someone doodling along and constantly looking over their shoulder for spooky ghosts that might happen by going through guard-infested dick camps, forcing you to listen to a bunch of boring stories that never involve sex or guns, or sex guns. Black Flag is more of an Odyssey-type game than a straightforward one, since for the entirety of it, Edward doesn't really know what he's doing in classic bumbling protagonist to glory's unknown fashion. The observatory, that artifact the Templars were jawing on about, is completely lost, and the only one who can find it is but a name on the wind. Meanwhile, Edward keeps running into his friends, getting into trouble with the government for committing a bunch of dastardly off-screen crimes. Since this is a post-Ezio Creed game, it is told in cinematic fashion, and the characters and plots the game tells are completely on point, intriguing, and awesome. I was really impressed with how Ubisoft captured Blackbeard in the game especially, because of course Blackbeard has to be in this game. Ubisoft shows both sides of him, the mythical demonic monster version where he wears sparklers on his head, screams at everyone, and blows everything up, and the other half being an old man tired with the constancy of hollow piracy and wants to retire on an island away from it all. And of all the words he could have said, retired was the one that marked him for death on his final mission helping out the struggling refuge of Nassau. Then there's James Kidd, some sort of 12-year-old coasting on the famousness of his last name, who apparently knew Edward long enough to become best friends with him, and while Ubisoft saved this as an attempted huge reveal later, I could at least guess long before about this twist, because whoever's doing James's voice acting isn't doing a good job disguising the twist.
I think you've a natural gift for it. The way you think and work. The way you understand the world.
The twist, that James Kidd is actually a female pirate turned assassin. Still don't know about the whole 12-year-old thing though, she kinda still looks like one. Alongside those two are a couple interchangeable pirates who do nothing but sit on their asses and get drunk all day trying to govern the tiny hovel of Nassau, a small shantytown that the collective pirate characters put a lot of effort into as a refuge for pirates away from the prying eyes of the government and jailers, where men can be truly free. But the damned place is so infested with rot, mice, pests, and diseases that even calling it a shantytown would be like calling a rambler a stately manor. For Ubisoft's credit, they certainly did a better job of telling an Ezio-styled character arc in one game with Edward than Connor, because it's surprisingly realistic as the years weigh on and all of Edward's spectacular heists and fool's errands earned him little more than petty coins and no respect among thieves as the time marches forward and his goal keeps getting whisked away from him. Nassau grinding even more into a shithole as no one put any actual effort into developing the town and spent most of their time on on beer and boobs. The government is cracking down to the point that the pirates are being hunted actively, tricked into prison through a BS pardoning system, and even start turning on each other when resources run dry, and even Edward's own crew turns on him when it's found out that he's been on this ridiculous quest for the observatory, slitting every well-known neck on that path for the better part of an entire flippin' decade. To be totally frank, Edward's journey is depressing, tiresome, tedious, and very much the entertaining spectacle you would get from someone fixated on fame and fortune above literally everything else in their life. It makes me wonder when he spent the time to write letters back home, when all that time was more likely used staring maniacally at his wall of clues covered in vibrant yarn. Progressively, as the campaign marches forward, he starts burning through any goodwill that he's had with all of his friends, and the ones that don't wind up dead or betraying him for anything more than spite look at him in utter contempt as a shell of a man chasing a phantom on a ship filled with good-for-nothing mercenaries. Throughout his story, Edward keeps coming back to the question of what is his value if he does not end up as a great man. This part is so frustrating because Edward could have the quote-unquote perfect life if he would just take his giant ego off the pedestal and go back to his wife in Wales and work a simple job. But if he cannot return with everything in hand, then he'll personally feel as a pile of worthless, nameless nothing. Hell, it even goes so far that James' kid, actually named Mary Read, dies in Edward's arms after a semi-botched prison escape that he got put in when he was betrayed by the sage called Black Bart. Like a lot of women in oldie times, it looks like Mary wasn't quite ready to have a kid just yet. Unfortunate for the assassins who lost one of the brightest stars. The loss of Mary starts putting things in perspective once Adewale managed to kick Edward out of the biggest drunken stupor known to man. That fantasy sequence was one of the best parts of the Creed franchise because it helped to show just how ludicrous and desperate Edward is on his quest to finding the ungodly fortune at the observatory that cost him his family, friends, and probably deep down his own self-respect. Thanks to the bottle teaching him a lesson about life, Edward starts finally picking himself up to the point that he reconciles some of his differences with the assassins. Helping to stop the annihilation of the village from the Spanish is definitely a nice touch, and goes on one last score to finding the observatory before the Templars can. Thanks to the assassin resources now available, Edward manages to end the last couple Templars in record time. The end of the Odyssey showing off the true pointlessness of his past self as the assassins lock away the observatory as being too powerful to be in anyone's hands, an inevitability that Edward actually accepts. And to cap off such a wonderfully woven tale, the game doesn't actually end on a 100% happy ending where Bambi's alive, all the pollution went away, and only the goodest politicians on the planet were running the show. It is a happy ending, but not entirely. Edward reconciles with the daughter he didn't know he had and learned that his wife died while he was dicking around the West Indies. The two form some sort of bond, and Edward goes on assassinating for a few more years before settling down in colonial America with a new woman he met and also a new son. And while that was deeply satisfying, the framing device is pretty meh overall. Face gets roped into some shadowy goings-on at Abstergo Entertainment, being puppeted around by the IT manager, John, who wants to get some details about the top brass's ultimate plan for the company. Obviously, what Abstergo actually wants is the observatory's location to profit from the power of being able to track literally anyone on the planet. Hell, they basically let Abstergo Entertainment exist because it produces enough money to quote-unquote pay the bills. John starts getting more and more unhinged later because it turns out that he's been done in by the stories of the late Juno, that crazy lady that Desmond released from her cell who was supposed to be enslaving all of humanity, but it turns out that she actually doesn't have the energy or the ability to do so without more followers. Then John dies after it's revealed that he's completely hat-stand. Overall, the framing device is dull and flimsy with no real justification for being there at all, much less that for whatever cosmically stupid reason, Sean and Rebecca from the Scooby Gang managed to become hired at Abstergo Entertainment as low-level employees, and who haphazardly rope Face into becoming a new member of their assassin cell. Ultimately, what everyone said about Black Flag is 100% true. It is the best Assassin's Creed game, hands down. The ship exploration and combat mechanics are great fun, they're challenging and opens up the player to multitudes of dicking around on the high seas, collecting money, and other meaningless nonsense. The Odyssey-type story of Edward bumbling his way between Assassin and Templar, hunting down the observatory and sacrificing friend and family along the way to do so, is an entertaining and noteworthy journey that you really should enjoy. The missions themselves in the campaign are pretty standard stuff, nothing really stood out. The on-land missions are god-awful tailing or eavesdropping missions only that just has Edward following a progressively slower and monotonous conversation about stupid bullcrap. The missions help to tell the story of how a pirate's life isn't all that it's cracked up to be, as the fledgling colony of Nassau is onset by rivals, the government, and the indifference of its own rulers. Black Flag's collectibles are a marked improvement from other games since they involve parkour skills and gameplay mastery to collect, instead of just plopping a bunch of bullshit on the map and telling the player to pick it all up, because reasons. If you've completely missed out on this game for whatever reason, then I would highly suggest grabbing it, because even if you aren't a fan of Creed games, Black Flag does so much new and so much to break the norm of its franchise that it has become the standout example for how Ubisoft can build quality even with its groupthink-centered staff of 1,000 individuals. I hope that newer games can take this momentum and go, but even if they can't, at least we got this flash in the pan from a series defined by its resistance to new ideas. I'll be tossing up a scoreboard for final numbers, and give you all a well-deserved victory for gamers. Thanks for tuning in.